All right. Well, this summer, we're sort of in the middle of a series we're calling FaceTime. But it's really each week has been sort of we're dropping in on a separate interaction that Jesus has with someone in the Gospels. And one of the things I've just been loving is a lot of these stories are very familiar, and even Jesus is very familiar. But when we slow down and we stop, sort of the consistent theme from week to week has just been how unparalleled Jesus is in his beauty and the way he interacts with people. How he kind of meets each person where they are and then goes deeper and sort of addresses that sort of truest need in their heart. The Gospels really give us a stunning portrait of Jesus when we slow down and we really look at them. And so that's sort of what we've been doing, and this morning is going to be no different. About a month ago, we looked at the passage where Jesus does his first miracle, where he turns the water into wine at the wedding. Today, at least according to the book of John, we're going to look at his last miracle. John chapter 11. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me there. But the topic we're going to talk about today is one that we are all familiar with, at least in at some level. And it's when God doesn't act the way that we think he should. We've all experienced that, right? When he allows us to go through something that's hard and painful, and we sort of scratch our heads and wonder, God, what are you doing? Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you show up and do something in this situation? We've all been there. I'm sure even just mentioning that, you flash back to some situation in your own life when you thought, God, what are you doing? And I'm sure for many of us, even this morning, right now, there's something going on that's hard, that's challenging, and it's difficult. It may be some sort of health issue, maybe for you or someone in your family, maybe recent, maybe you've been battling it for years, and you're just wondering, God, with a snap of your fingers, you could take this away, and yet you're not. Why? I started thinking about different people in our church, and I very quickly got into double digits of people that I know are dealing with different medical things that are painful and stressful and financially draining. Maybe it's more with your job. Maybe you're looking for a job. Maybe you wish you had a different job. Maybe there's that person at work who's just really difficult, and you're asking, God, why do you have this for me right now? Sometimes it's even good things that are hard, like parenting. My wife saw a shirt last week that said, my kids are keeping me from being the parent I always thought I'd be. Isn't that great? How true is that? I always pictured me being this great parent. But most nights we actually go to bed thinking, wow, parenting's really hard. Very rarely do we think, wow, we knocked it out of the park today. There's pain in marriage. There's pain in singleness. There's pain related to aging parents. I mean, we could keep going. There's a lot of different difficulty and pain in this life. And the kind of pain that comes up in the passage we're going to look at this morning is the pain that we fear the most. It's the pain of death. The pain of losing a loved one. And we don't even want to think about it. And we certainly don't really want to talk about it. And whenever it comes, it's always too soon. You know, all we have to do is mention the pain and the grief involved with death, and all of us go somewhere. Maybe you go to a grandparent or a parent, maybe a sibling, a child, maybe even an unborn child, a friend of the family. The grief of death is a frequent visitor that we all have to live with. The last couple months have had some couple different situations that have been fairly close to our family. We shared about one of my best friends who lost his 6-year-old son unexpectedly. I mean, as you can imagine, it's just completely wrecked their world, and we've sort of been walking with them in that. Even actually, you can be praying. My wife's going to go spend a few days with them this week. They're back in the States, so you can be praying for her. But another situation that hit our family pretty hard, my dad's best friend, who's kind of like an uncle to me and my siblings growing up, he was a marathon swimmer a couple months ago, was out swimming and got hit by a boat and drowned. But both these situations have really just made it so the last few months we've been just sort of processing the grief of death. And all of us can never get that far away from it. Not really. And as we see the grief expressed in this passage, in John 11, I think you're going to resonate with it. You have personally experienced this before. And it brings up those same questions. God, why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you do something? I came to you for help, and you didn't respond the way I thought you should. So let's get into this passage with these questions in our minds. And as I've been reading it, there's sort of three different details in this passage that have sort of risen to the surface, sort of stuck out to me. And I think as we look at these details, these observations, we're going to see just three different principles that stand out on suffering as it relates to our relationship with God. So let's get into this. We're going to start John 11 in verse 1. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village Mary and his sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. All right, so we have this family from Bethany. It's just on the outside of Jerusalem. We have these two sisters, Mary and Martha, and they have this younger brother probably named Lazarus. And Lazarus gets sick. Now, verse 2 tries to help us see which Mary we're talking about. You can put the verses back up. It sort of has this parenthetical statement about who this Mary is. Now, it's interesting. This exact scene that it's referring to hasn't happened yet in John. It's going to be in John chapter 12. But as is probably true, this was a very famous encounter between Mary and Jesus, where she pours this perfume on her feet and wipes her hair. So that had been sort of passed down. People already knew of that incident. And because there's a lot of different Marys, John draws our attention to this is the one we're talking about. But by drawing our attention to that scene, it sort of shows the extent of love that Mary had for Jesus. I mean, how many people would you wipe their feet with your hair? Probably not even your spouse, right? So Mary loves Jesus even more than you love your spouse. But this love is reciprocated. And that's what really stands out in these first few verses. Notice the sisters' message to Jesus in verse 3. They don't say the one that we love is sick. They say the one you love is sick. Jesus loves Lazarus. In fact, the next couple verses continue this theme of this mutual love that was enjoyed in this relationship between Jesus and this family. Look at verse 4. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now, I'm sure as you've been reading the Bible, you notice the Bible doesn't have a lot of detail, especially in the narrative section. It's pretty right to the point. So whenever something gets sort of stressed over and over again, it's sort of a clue to kind of pay attention to it because it's significant. And in these 5 verses, over and over again, John keeps bringing up sort of the love that exists in these relationships. I mean, he reminded us of how much Mary loves Jesus to the extent she'd wipe his feet with her hair. We even see their love for Jesus in the fact that when they're in their deepest trouble, when they're in their biggest need, who do they reach out to? They reach out to Jesus. When we're in trouble, we reach out to the people that we love most. And that's what Mary and Martha do. But this love is both ways. Jesus loves them, and verse 5 explicitly draws our attention to this. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. This is where I'd love to know more of the story. Like, what's the backstory? How did Jesus and this family get so close? We don't really know. There's one other incident recorded in Luke 10, and that's the scene where Martha's running around like crazy serving and Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet. But that's the only other detail. We don't know how long they've been following Jesus, but they do have this very intimate relationship such that they kind of consider themselves family. Jesus, the one you love, is sick. Now, that's sort of the stress of the first 5 verses. Now, look at the first part of verse 6. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, now don't read for a second. How would you expect this sentence to finish? First 5 verses, Jesus loves them. They love Jesus. So how would you expect this verse to finish? When he heard that he was sick, he jumped on a plane to Bethany, right? First thing he did, he dropped everything and he went. That's what we'd expect. When our son Nathan was born and had a lot of different complications, and we were sort of in the NICU, the first people we called were our parents. People we love and that we know love us. And the first thing they did is jump on a plane or start driving and came to us as fast as they could. That's what you'd expect, right? Well, as you know, that's not what it says. Jesus loves them. Maybe the sisters expected Jesus to sort of heal Lazarus on the spot. And Jesus, he's not limited by distance. He's healed people from afar before. So maybe they thought, we'll send word to Jesus, and Jesus will just heal him from, 2 days' journey away where he is. That's not what happens. Look at the end of verse 6. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And somewhere in that span of 2 days, the unthinkable happens for Mary and Martha. And Lazarus breathes his last. They watch their little brother die. Now, I think there's actually a principle for us in here. So we'll keep going with the story. It's actually a theological principle. Because as we've noted so far, the stress of this chapter has been on the love that's between them. And then verse 6 says, it's almost because of this love, he intentionally delayed. Here's, I think, the principle for us. It's to interpret your sufferings by God's love rather than interpret his love by your sufferings. See the difference? Interpret your sufferings by his love rather than interpreting his love sort of by your sufferings. I don't know about you, there's always this temptation whenever something painful happens to sort of finish this sentence. God, if you really loved me, blank, and you fill it in. You wouldn't have let me lose my job. You wouldn't have given me cancer. You wouldn't have let my marriage fail. It would have been easy for Mary and Martha to finish this sentence. Jesus, if you loved us, you wouldn't have let Lazarus die. And yet we know that's not true. That it's not true that Jesus doesn't love them. We know that the verse right before explicitly highlights his love for them. And there's just a great temptation to sort of look at our circumstances and allow them to tell us about God rather than the other way around. The picture I keep thinking about in this is sort of being swept up in a tornado. That's what it feels like, right? When you're in the middle of grief. Like can't know up from down, you don't know left from right, everything's just sort of swirling around you. And when you're in that situation, what do you anchor yourself to? What are you tethered to? Often it seems like we're tethered to our emotions and sort of what we're feeling. I mean, they're intense. They seem like the most concrete, real thing. And so we sort of tether ourselves to them, rather than tethering ourselves to the truth about God that's been revealed and letting them sort of speak to what we're feeling. The problem really is one of perspective. When we're in that tornado, we just can't see the bigger picture. They can't see in this moment how Jesus can be loving and also allow their brother to die. I mean, we can see it. We've read John 11 before. We know the bigger picture, but they can't. All they can see is the pain and the grief that they're experiencing. I think I've probably had us do this before. On your worship guide, or maybe the card in your seat or whatever, I think there's a pen. Just draw a circle for a second. Now, this circle, just for a second, this circle represents all knowledge, okay? All knowledge in the world. It's all history. It's all scientific knowledge. It's all sociological knowledge. Everything that exists, all the knowledge in the world, okay? Now, I want you just to sort of shade in the portion of all knowledge that you think you know. Okay? Sort of shade that much of the circle in. And whenever I do that little exercise, it sort of reminds me of how limited I really am. Like maybe adopt. I don't have the bigger picture. if I'm honest, I have to at least admit that it's possible that there's more going on than I can really see. That God's doing something in His infinite wisdom that I cannot, in my finiteness, understand. And I think that's the attitude that allows us to stay tethered to God in the middle of that tornado. I don't have the bigger picture. And because I don't have the bigger picture, I'm going to be careful about drawing any conclusions about who God is or how He feels about me in this moment. Now, it's interesting. This doesn't make it less painful. This won't make the grief any less severe. But what it does affect is it affects our relationship with God, right? It reflects, it changes how much we're going to actually want to come to Him when we're going through something difficult. Have you ever noticed how in difficulty some people are actually drawn closer to God and others seem to be pushed further away? Now that's some related to His grace in our lives, but it's also related to what's sort of fixed in our hearts and what's sort of up for grabs. So take God's love for a second. I think this is really important for those of us who live on this side of the cross. Is God's love for us still up for grabs? Or has that been forever proven? Has God already sort of definitively proven that He loves each of us? And in the cross, sort of gone to, there's no other way He could have expressed it any more clearly how much He loves us. And so that's sort of a done deal. We don't question that anymore. So now when we're going through something else, we know He loves us. So how do we make sense of what we're going through? Is that a fixed sort of thing, settled in the past, or is that still sort of up for grabs every day in what we're going through? We interpret our sufferings by His love, not His love by our sufferings. So I think that's the first thing we see. It's kind of a theological idea, and it's important to wrestle with it, that love sometimes has delays, like we see here. But often when we're in the middle of grief, this isn't terribly helpful, right? We need more than just right theology when we're in the middle of something. We need that, but we need more, and I think that's what we're going to see next. The next observation, it comes sort of in the next section, and I want to draw your attention to how Jesus interacts with each of these women, okay, with both Martha and Mary. Okay, this is a little bit long. I want to read his whole interactions, then we'll go back and talk about it. Verse 17. On His arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet Him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and he's asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she had gone to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? All right, so that's the part we'll look at now. Jesus is truly remarkable. I mean, he is absolutely beautiful in the way he steps into the grief of these two women in a unique way. And what really struck me is that both women say the exact same thing, verbatim. Did you notice that? Verse 21 and verse 32. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So two different women dealing with the same grief who say the exact same thing. What does Jesus do? Well, with Martha, Jesus takes on the ministry of truth. I mean, he can tell her heart is sort of tending towards despair, and so he sort of wants to interact and cut flow that despair in her heart by combating it with truth. I mean, their interchange almost sounds like a theological debate. She believes in the program of God, but Jesus wants to show her it's a whole lot more than that. It's about not a program, it's this person. I am the resurrection and the life. This is Jesus claiming deity, that he is fully God, that everything that lives and breathes owes its existence to him. So he fights this despair in her heart with the truth of who he is. Martha needed this ministry of truth. And so Jesus meets her there. But with Mary, she doesn't need this ministry of truth. She gets this ministry of tears. Jesus barely says anything, and yet he communicates a lot through his actions. In the shortest verse in the entire Bible, Jesus wept. I mean, this is an amazing expression of the humanity of Jesus. He sympathizes with her. He sees his dear friend in this utter grief, and it moves him to tears. Now, this is kind of shocking, because Jesus knows what he's about to do. Imagine you're Jesus, and you are in this scene, and you know what you're about to do. You know in the span of minutes, all of the tears are going to be gone, and people are going to be laughing, and they're going to be joyful. If you or I in that situation, I think we would have a little grin on our face. We'd kind of be rubbing our hands together, and we'd be saying, hey, watch what I'm about to do. But not Jesus. He is so present in this moment, and he sees his friend so deeply that it moves him. It doesn't matter what he's about to do. He knows that the way you deal with deep sadness isn't by speaking truth to it, it's by entering into it. And so he joins Mary in her sorrow. Jesus gives Martha what she needs, this ministry of truth, gives Mary what she needs, this ministry of tears. And here's sort of more of a relational principle that jumped out as I was looking at this, is that only Jesus, as fully God and fully man, can perfectly meet our need in grief. Everybody needs this ministry of truth at times, and this ministry of tears at times. Sometimes we need a friend, we need somebody to give us truth, to sort of grab us by the shoulders and say, wake up, you're not looking at this the right way. Oftentimes we just need somebody to weep with us. Now sometimes to lay truth on somebody when they're grieved is absolutely wrong. And sometimes the opposite's true. Just to weep with someone and not tell them the truth is equally wrong. None of us has the right temperament or the right patience or the right insight to give everybody exactly what they need all the time. Even some of our personalities, some of us are prone more to confront, and some of us are prone more towards sympathy. But this is where the relational beauty of Jesus is unparalleled. He can step into every situation. He's never strong when he's supposed to be tender. He's never tender when he's supposed to be strong. Now listen to how Tim Keller talks about Jesus' sort of relational capacity. He said, it is in this paradox that he's both God and human that gives Jesus an overwhelming beauty. He is the lion, and he's the lamb. Despite his high claims, his claims of deity, he's never pompous. You never see him standing on his own dignity. Despite being absolutely approachable to the weakest and the broken, he's completely fearless before corrupt and powerful. He has tenderness without weakness, strength without harshness, humility without the slightest lack of confidence. unhesitating authority with a complete lack of self-absorption. Holiness and unending convictions without any shortage of approachability. Power without insensitivity. You and I, when we're grieving, we need other people. But other people can't meet our need fully the way that Jesus can. He's the only one who can meet our need in the deepest way, who can actually see us and see what ministry we need. Do we need someone to weep with us? Do we need the truth? And most likely all the time we need a little combination of both. The problem is, and I felt this, I'm sure you felt this too, is oftentimes when we're in pain, we don't want to go to Jesus. Because we kind of feel like, in a way, he's behind it. He's allowed it. And so he doesn't terribly always feel safe to come to when we're grieving. And that's what I think we see in this last part. What will stand out sort of addresses that. Like, can we even go to Jesus when we're in pain? Look at verse 38. Let's read this last paragraph. Jesus, once more deeply moved, he came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there will be a bad odor, for he has been dead for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Now, the first verse in this part, verse 38, I'm not sure why this is, but every single translation seems to translate it like it is here. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. The problem is, if you read any commentary, or if you look up this Greek word, it's actually more specific than that. It's not just that Jesus was deeply moved. This word really means to bellow with anger. Jesus is furious. He's bellowing with rage. It's like he's roaring. What is Jesus, what or who is Jesus so angry at? It's really the same word back in verse 33, too. What is he angry at? There's absolutely no indication here that Jesus is angry with the people who are weeping. That's not where his anger lies. What Jesus is angry at is he's angry at death itself. He hates it. He's angry at the suffering and the grief that he's witnessing. I mean, think about what difference that makes. It's not that Jesus says, "Hey, listen, guys, just get used to it. This is part of life. You just need to roll with this thing here. This happens to all of us. Don't make it such a big deal." Jesus doesn't say that. He's looking squarely at our greatest nightmare. The loss of life, the loss of loved ones, the loss of love itself. And he is incensed. He is mad at this evil and this suffering. And what sort of hit me this week is that even though Jesus is God, he's not mad at himself. I mean, think about who we get mad at when we're going through something painful. We often get mad at God, right? So Jesus is in the midst of this grief, and he's furious, but he's not furious at himself. And one of the things that means is that he never intended us to experience death and suffering and pain. That is not part of his original plan. He is not the one to blame for this. The suffering that we experience is a result of this fallen world. The sin that came when we turned our backs on God, and now we sort of live with the consequences of that. But Jesus hates it as much as we do, the pain that we experience. So then the obvious question next is, well then, if he hates it so much, why doesn't he do something about it? Why doesn't he sort of show up on the scene, snap his fingers, and make all of the pain and the suffering and the evil go away? But that question sort of reveals a lack of self-knowledge, doesn't it? Because for all of us, we know that deep down, what's wrong with the world has to do with each of our hearts. So much of the misery in life is due to the selfishness and the pride and the cruelty and the anger and the oppression and the wars and the violence that starts in our own hearts. Which would mean that if Jesus came and did what we want him to do, if he came down with a sword in his hand on judgment to make everything right, none of us would be left to talk about it. I heard someone say once, the line between good and evil runs right through the human heart. Jesus, he did come to fix what's wrong with the world, the suffering that's in the world, but not with a sword in his hands, but with nails in his hands. And he didn't come to bring judgment, he came to bear judgment. And in this very passage, we actually see Jesus sort of beginning to unfold his plan of dealing with what's wrong with the world. We're not going to read all the way down to there, but later in this passage, the Jewish sort of ruling party, they get together because they realize after this display of power, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, Jesus is way more dangerous than he ever was before. And so they come up with a plan, and you see it in verse 53. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. I mean, Jesus knew that this is what was going to happen. He knew this. He knew if he raised Lazarus from the dead, the religious establishment was going to kill him. He knew that the only way to bring Lazarus out of the grave was for himself to step into the grave. The only way to interrupt Lazarus' funeral was to summon his own. If he was going to save us from death, he was going to have to go to the cross and bear that judgment that we deserve. I mean, that's why Jesus is so angry here. I mean, he's approaching Lazarus' tomb, and instead of sort of smiling at the prospect of what he's about to do, he's shaking with anger. And he has these hot tears running down his face because he knows it's going to cost him his life to do what he's about to do. He can sort of feel the jaws of death sort of closing in on him. And knowing all of that, he says, Lazarus, come out. It's funny, I heard someone say, if he didn't say Lazarus by name, all of the dead would have come out. And here's sort of the emotional principle that I've been thinking about. Is that God is not to blame for our suffering. He hates it even more than we do. He stepped in at great cost to himself to bring about its undoing. I think that's what we need to wrestle with at the emotional level. That'll make us actually want to go to Jesus, who's the only one who can deal with our pain. He feels about our pain the same way we do. And we see that in this passage. He's not distant. He's not uninvolved. He's not uncaring. No, he's deeply moved by it. He's angry with us at it, and he weeps with us in it. And in the pain we feel, he points us to the cross. And he says, I hate the pain you're experiencing so much that I'm willing to go to the cross for it. To put an end to it. And you just need to hold on. You don't see the bigger picture yet, but hold on. I'm making it all right. It's going to be all right in the end. You just can't see that yet. So in your pain, look to what I'm doing. I'm in the process of destroying what you hate so much. Now we're going to actually end the service by singing a lament. Laments, we see laments all through the book of Psalms. But we've almost lost the ability to sing laments. A lament has a formal complaint. It's sort of this honest recognition that we don't like what's happening. And God, we're gonna bring that to you. But in every lament, there's also this acknowledgement of trust. God, I don't have the bigger picture, so I'm going to hang on to you. I'm going to keep myself tethered to you while I'm in the tornado. We sang this a few weeks ago. If it's unfamiliar, just listen to the words. But as you learn it, it's a simple song. It's important that we sing these laments because they're so honest about where we are lots of the times. So I'm going to pray for us, and then we can stand and sing.